So the 3 days of testing action ahead of the 2023 Formula 1 season are finally complete. But testing never gives us the full picture, so these are the 5 biggest questions that still remain ahead of the first race. First up, we have Aston Martin. What is their true pace? To me, it seems like they're anywhere from the 2nd quickest car on the grid to the 5th quickest car. The biggest question is, how close are they to Mercedes, or are they even ahead of Mercedes, especially in the early part of this season? Overall, despite some electrical problems on the first day, it was a pretty faultless test from Aston Martin, and they're looking really good. The car just looks incredibly hooked up. I would say it's sort of comparable to what we have seen with the Red Bull and the Ferrari. The Mercedes at times is still looking pretty loose. Obviously, when we got on the grippier tyres later on in the test, it looked a little bit better, but that also comes with the tyres. So when we talk about Mercedes, it's really hard to gauge where they are. So are Aston Martin potentially starting the 2023 Formula 1 season ahead of Mercedes? And even coming into pre-season testing, that is not something that I thought we would be discussing. I had incredibly high hopes for Aston Martin, and at very worst case scenario, they should be finishing sort of 5th in the Constructors this year. But the pace we saw at times from Fernando Alonso, especially in his race runs, and to his credit, Felipe Drugovich as well, looked really good. For me, it's no question that Aston Martin are the team that are going to make the biggest jump forward this season. We'll get on to which team may be making the biggest leap backwards a little bit later in the video. But on the whole, our biggest takeaway from pre-season testing is absolutely Aston Martin have made a massive jump. And it's no surprise with the inclusion of Dan Fallows now being at the team for about a year and a half, also some Mercedes staff brought in, and also just other hirings around the technical department. With all the money the team has and the staff that they now have, there's no reason they shouldn't be making this big leap, and it seems they have. But will it be ahead of Mercedes? And that's what we'll wait and see. Number 2, Alpine. What the hell is going on with Alpine? I have absolutely no idea where Alpine sit in the pecking order. They didn't give us any performance runs. Their race pace data seems alright. I think they're going to be a very solid team. But we never saw a performance run from them, and they just sort of quietly got on with testing. They didn't have any major problems. Maybe they were held in the garage here or there for about 20 minutes, but on the whole, it was incredibly drama-free, and they came out incredibly bullish around their car launch, saying, you know what, we want to be closer to 3rd place this year than we are to 5th, and also being fairly confident in the idea of staying in 4th place. But I think when you're in a battle against Fernando Alonso and Aston Martin, that might be difficult. So where are Alpine going to sit? They've got 2 good drivers. I wouldn't say either of them are absolute world class, as in they could be world champions, but they're 2 very solid drivers who, okay, yeah, let's put aside the potential rivalry between the teammates for a minute, should be picking up good points each race. There's no reason they shouldn't be if the car is there for them. But when going over the winners and losers from testing, can we put Alpine into any section? They've clearly been able to get along with their race plan perfectly fine, but there's no performance running whatsoever from them, and I don't know, it's just left me quite confused. Where do they sit? Are they close to Mercedes? Because that's sort of what they were hinting at when they were coming into this season before testing began. We never really saw any evidence of it. The car looks like it's handling fine, a few lockups here and there, a couple of bits of oversteer, but that's normal to be expected. But for this one, guys, let me know where you think they'll be down in the comment section. I think they'll be in the battle with Aston Martin potentially for 4th and 5th in the Constructors' standings, but I'm not sure if Aston Martin are actually that little step ahead of them and could be, obviously, like we said earlier, competing with Mercedes in the early part of the season. But if I had to put money on it right now, I would put Alpine 5th in the sort of car performance rankings. Obviously, we do have the problems at Aston Martin at the moment with, well, Felipe Drugovich having to race in the first event because Lance Stroll has his injury and will potentially be missing 1 or 2 races, maybe even more. We don't know how serious it is. Next up, we have the order of the expected bottom 4 teams. Now for this, we're including Haas, Alfa Romeo, AlphaTauri and Williams. I cannot begin to predict what order these teams are in. I guess if I had to, I would go for probably Williams being at the lower end and Haas being around the top end, but I think it could vary race by race, definitely. Alfa Romeo showed glimpses of pace throughout testing, AlphaTauri did on the last day, Williams had a fairly quiet test, but they got a lot of laps in, and at times, especially with Logan Sargent on the second day, were able to put in some fairly reasonable runs. Haas say they've had the best pre-season test that they've had for about half a decade. Alfa Romeo barely had any problems, AlphaTauri seemed fine, and Williams also just got on with the job. I don't think we've got a clear backmarker this year. I do think Williams, on average throughout the whole season, might be the team that come out last, but I don't think we're going to have what we've seen in previous seasons of cars being lapped 2 or 3 times during a race. Obviously, we will still see cars being lapped. That's just going to happen. I think over especially the longer races, you're going to see it, especially on shorter circuits as well. But overall, we could have quite a few races where there's only 1, 2, 3 cars being lapped. It does seem like field spread might have closed in a little bit. And obviously that just makes it even harder to predict the midfield and, like I've said, this lower bunch. For our fourth question, we have how much time, if any, have Mercedes lost to Red Bull and Ferrari? Now, as I've alluded to before, it was not clean sailing for Mercedes. They had overnight emergency team meetings to discuss aero stalling on the front axle on the second night of testing. The car just didn't look that great. The rear end looked incredibly loose, especially through the fast corners and actually saying that even on traction. And when you're looking at the teams like Ferrari and Red Bull, where Ferrari especially, traction is a massive strong point, we are going to be asking a question when, compared to how competitive Mercedes were at the end of last season, potentially even fighting for wins at times, surely they're not going to start this year at that same level. We do know Mercedes have a major upgrade package coming in for Azerbaijan, so the first couple of races could be pretty tricky for them. And that's why our first question was, can Aston Martin get anywhere near them? It just seems that Mercedes at this moment in time are definitely a step up on where they started last season, but I do think they could be a reasonable step down compared to the top two where they ended last season. And obviously this raises a question of how much can they develop throughout the season. I do think we'll see the biggest development curve across the whole field come from Mercedes. We basically saw that last year, and I wouldn't rule out seeing that again, especially considering how much trouble they seem to be in at the moment. And then when we're talking about Red Bull and Ferrari, I guess I can get a quick mention in this video. Red Bull very much looking pretty ominous at the moment. The race pace, the qualifying pace, it's all looking very good. The Ferrari, still an incredibly drivable car. It's still got the same strengths as last year, and hopefully will have a little more straight line speed, as they have hopefully and seemingly from testing resolved the reliability issues, which is what ultimately held them back in the 2022 season, because after Azerbaijan and a string of retirements they had to turn the engines down, and that very clearly cost them throughout the rest of the season. Last, and I very much fear least, we have McLaren. What is going on with McLaren? They had by far the least amount of total laps run in testing. They had several problems with the wheel brow, which is the bit that you can see just above the tyre, the wheel arch really, but we call it the wheel brow, it's more fun. There were problems with that part not being strong enough. That was obviously an effort in weight saving that's just gone horribly wrong, and with the amount of flexing it was doing, it also affects the aero data as well, because that's not what will be happening in a week's time. So McLaren overall, they lost a lot of track running and had by far the least amount of track time out of any team on the grid. We're also just hearing overall very negative things coming from the team at the moment. Zach Brown saying they have not hit the performance targets that they had set themselves, and yeah, it will probably be an improvement on last year's car, but unfortunately the rest of the grid's making a massive step up. We're into the second year of new aero regulations. You cannot afford to only be making baby steps. You have got to make big strides from the previous year, as Aston Martin are probably going to prove. But on top of the bad mood it seems there already is in the team, it may not be the only problem. Lando Norris, according to Will Buxton, was seen punching a wall out of frustration. Nothing too hard. He's not punching a hole in the wall or anything, but just hitting a wall in frustration. And that's something that you do see in, you know, elite level athletes, because that's what this is. It's very high stakes. And Lando Norris, having signed that long-term contract with McLaren just a couple of years ago, still got a few years remaining, he's maybe saying that this was a very bad investment of a few precious years of his career. Ultimately, McLaren are under a lot of pressure this year to develop that car, because I would not be surprised if they're suffering around the lower midfield. I'd probably put them 6th or 7th at the moment. It's not looking good for McLaren. They tried a couple of performance runs, it didn't go great. Not a lot of race runs either, so yeah, overall really looking bad for McLaren. But they're under a lot of pressure, because if they don't improve this year, they could be losing Lando. He is a very high-level driver, and I think Ferrari were potentially lucky not to lose Leclerc when they were really underperforming for a couple of years. Not sure Lando will stay around for maybe as long as McLaren want, especially with Audi joining the sport in 2025, and Andreas Seidel, the former McLaren team principal, probably sniffing around for a driver or two. Then, of course, you've got Lando being offered seats at Red Bull. That's been confirmed. Maybe it's been thrown around he could replace Hamilton when he retires and give us a all-British lineup at Mercedes. Basically, the rumours are Lando could be on the move if things don't get better. So that's the fifth question. What are McLaren going to do? But if you've got any more questions that you'd like to add on top of that, let me know down in the comments. Or if you've got any answers to what I've posed today, again, let me know. And if you want to join the very exclusive club with Doctor Who and become a subscriber to the channel, press the subscribe button just below. And while you're down there, don't forget to like this video and ring the notification bell so you get all of the latest from our videos or from our streams, where we can have just a great live chat about anything and everything Formula 1. Also, if you want to give us a follow on Twitter, it's at RaceBeacon TV, as you can see in the bottom left. And guys, until next time, See ya.